I have no face.
For those who may not remember, before the creation of this series, I'd never seen a Studio Ghibli film. I'd absorbed a few ideas through cultural osmosis, but I hadn't caught more than a passing glimpse of even their most well-regarded works. Going in totally blind, without reading any research, reviews, or even basic plot information, I'm slowly but surely working my way through the mainline studio canon. To further mix things up, I'm watching them in no predefined order, with each film selected by a randomizing program. So go back and watch the first episode at the link in the description if you missed it, then join us back here for episode 2 of Discovering Ghibli. Howl's Moving Castle follows Sophie, a small-town hatmaker who finds herself transformed into a decrepit elderly woman by a cruel witch. Taking up residence with a cavalcade of peculiar creatures in the enigmatic Howl's shape-shifting, place-hopping home, Sophie finds herself entangled between warring kingdoms, the search for a lost prince, uncovering the origins of Howl's magical abilities, and her personal quest to undo her curse. Coming off of the relatively straightforward plotting of my previous Ghibli experiences, Howl's Moving Castle is a much harder hurdle to clear in terms of comprehension, understanding, or even making basic sense of what's going on in any given scene. Now, none of this would be a deal breaker if there was at least something to anchor me to this dazzling world of meticulously composed wonderment, but the individual plot threads feel more like a difficult jumble than a dense but meaningful collage. For long-time followers of the channel, you'll know I embrace dream logic, room for interpretation, and brain-teasing bafflement, but only so long as they're consistent. The themes here are simple enough. Appreciating and embracing the process of aging, the futility of trying to solve problems with violence, but unfortunately, these are all muddled up, as Howl's Moving Castle frequently crosses the line from obscure to eye-rolling. Character motivations are all over the place, and at times borderline incoherent. Remorseless villains who routinely try to murder the good guys are suddenly welcomed and nurtured as allies because... reasons? When the witch curses Sophie, it happens so early on and with so little character justification, it feels more like an arbitrary affliction rather than a motivating obstacle. As for the curse itself, the rules seem to change from moment to moment. In one instance she's young again, then middle-aged, then in her 90s, sometimes all within the space of a few minutes. The raging war going on in the background of all of this has no grand conclusion. Instead, it's quickly snuffed out in the final 2.5 minutes when the missing prince, who up to this point has barely been mentioned, is found, thereby ending a conflict that has left incalculable numbers of people dead without so much as a shoulder shrug. Thankfully, despite its tedious stretches of laboured execution, Howl's Moving Castle's scattershot approach does result in some saving graces that still make this all worth your time, namely, the visuals. This is a start-to-finish marvel of creativity and design that sits at the very peak of what the genre has to offer. European sensibilities are mashed up with steampunk and homespun warmth, as every character and environment is animated and articulated with flourishes of beauty and compositional perfection. The throw as much at the screen and see what sticks approach may have sunk the plot, but it allows all these dazzling character designs to soar with distinctive, endlessly memorable creativity that rivals the best of what I've seen from this or any studio. I mean, if Whisper of the Heart has the most realistic cat ever drawn to life, here we have the most huggable, lovable, scruffy little dog. All told, Howl's Moving Castle is an undeniable feast for the eyes, even if the rest of it left me feeling disappointedly empty. Continuing Miyazaki's hard-on for flying, planes, central characters that are in some way cursed, and anti-war messaging, Porco Rosso straps in alongside this piggish gent for some bounty hunting, aerial maneuvering hijinks as he seeks to best a rival pilot, stop the bad guys, and reclaim some of the humanity that has long since evaded his grasp. Making our protagonist a pig that can fly is more than just an obvious joke. Rosso's drive and reason are driven by an inherent, deep-seated piggishness. When paid to capture a gang of child abductors, he chooses to release them without punishment after taking a hefty bribe from their ill-gotten ransom money. In accepting payment both from the authorities and the suspects he's supposed to apprehend, he's wallowing in his role as a capitalist pig, working both sides for profit while perpetuating a cycle of crime and punishment. He's also a chauvinist pig, harbouring standoffish, old-fashioned ideas about women and their roles in more traditionally male-dominated fields, such as engineering and mechanics. While I appreciate the attempt at fleshing out what could have been a one-note gag, Porco Rosso truly excels when it grounds its pathos and humour in modest, character-focused asides. Upon hearing that Madame Gina's husband has died in a plane crash, the response is silence. Porco allows a wordless beat of empathy, understanding, and reflection, then they move on. It feels as authentic as it is necessary to the understanding of their relationship, and it's just one example of how strong a command Miyazaki has on these little moments. Be it a group of children who seem to think being kidnapped by honest-to-goodness pirates is hilarious, the greatest punch-up since They Live, or testing an engine until it disintegrates the building around it, such rich, painterly detail elevates even the smallest of touches. Unfortunately, when Porco Rosso tries to reconcile this flying bacon boy with its cast of female characters, the messaging becomes inconsistent, if not outright offensive. And that's looking past the uncomfortable optics of multiple women, one of whom is a child, trying to get it on with a pig. What starts as a somewhat endearing curmudgeonly man confronts his boorish behaviour and learns to respect women arc is wildly imbalanced. The second act is devoted to celebrating the young Fio's skills and accomplishments as Rosso learns to respect her as more than an object, only for the final act to reduce her to an effing trophy. It feels like an incomplete thought, one that falters to the same sexism it was trying to denounce. In fact, aside from the central rivalry between Rosso and the arrogant American hotshot Curtis, very few of the plot threads seem to lead anywhere. There's a war going on that's background noise at best, and at one point Rosso is chased by the secret police, which has little to no impact on anything else. Even the curse that turned the once human pilot Marco Pagett into Porco Rosso is never explained beyond "a bunch of my friends died and flew their planes to heaven, but I survived and am now a pig, I guess?" Many of my Ghibli-loving friends consider this a top-tier entry, and I can absolutely see why from the moments of brilliance. I just wish the whole film could maintain those lofty altitudes, without so often sputtering around with its head in the clouds. In this darling take on The Little Mermaid, this adorable aquatic creature swims off from her seafaring father, winding up on dry land and in the care of 5-year-old Sosuke. Ponyo, growing accustomed to the surface world, transforms into a little girl, while her father frantically tries to return her to the ocean in an attempt to stave off disaster. As far as openings go, Ponyo may have the most arresting, visually moving introduction of any animated feature I've seen since Pixar's Up. This vibrant, dialogue-free 7-minute sprawl is a cavalcade of life swirling below the waves. As it burst and bloomed with colour and light, all backed by one of my favourite Ghibli scores to date, I was immediately sold. It's worth noting that, while not without its creepier moments of nightmare fuel, Ponyo skews much younger than any Ghibli film I've seen so far, and that's fine with me. It's all just so charming. From Ponyo's father, who looks like a cross between Rod Stewart and David Bowie in Labyrinth, to an all-too-human parental spat that takes place across land and sea via the medium of signal lamps, this film emanates a curious slice-of-life joy. But alas, it can't quite sustain all that whimsy for the entire runtime. From the midpoint on, things start to noticeably drag. While increasingly destructive weather patterns make their way inland, bringing with them a sense of vague peril, without a villain to push back against Ponyo's burgeoning humanity, it starts to feel rudderless. This could have been alleviated if they'd established Ponyo's life before she set foot on land, as well as her troubled familial relationships. A father who doesn't want his little girl to grow up and leave, the parallels between these two parents and their frequently absent other halves. Sadly, these are skimmed over rather than explored, meaning the final stretch of the film feels lacking in weight and ultimately rushed towards a conclusion that feels kind of off. The happy ending here sees Ponyo's parents, who for all intents and purposes are decent enough people, giving away their toddler to complete strangers. There's no reason for them to believe her life will be any better with these people they barely know, other than her fondness for ham and just vague enough to raise questions proclamations of love from a preschool boy. While it's lacking in drive and stretched a little thin, there's so much to latch onto that it's hard to gripe too hard about the lack of depth and dynamic storytelling. I walked away from it feeling lighter on my feet, and how can you not love that? Pom Poko places us in the mischievous midst of the forest-dwelling tanuki, shape-shifting activists hell-bent on stopping mankind from devouring their natural habitat. The environmental message here, another Ghibli trademark at this point, is so blatant it may as well be written in neon, but it deserves credit for how it focuses on specifically Japanese failures of natural protection. For all its eccentric presentation and beguiling imagery, don't worry, we'll get to that in a minute, this is guerrilla warfare in the name of self-preservation, run through the prism of talking woodland critters and frolicking folklore. When I say warfare, I mean it. The last thing I expected was guttural pitch-black jokes at the expense of these would-be raccoons accidentally murdering a bunch of humans.
A series of bizarre accidents killed 3 workers.
We should have a moment of silence for the unfortunate victims, and then, right after that, we can celebrate! Yay!
Throwing itself between slapstick childishness and wildly inappropriate gags about sex, death and political infighting, this may be the funniest Ghibli film I've seen to date, owing in no small part to the English language voice cast. The Americanized translation and stellar performances give the English dub a distinct carefree abandon. That's no accident. You'll recognise alumni from all these favourites that are currently popping up on screen, and just about every other animated property you've ever loved. So far so great, right? Well, the problem with throwing so many ideas at the screen without pacing, consistency, and a firm tonal grasp of the material, you're constantly at risk of coming away from the track, and Pom Poko flies off the rails almost immediately. It's a textbook case of a film being too weird for its own good, and by God, weird is the understatement of the decade when trying to summarise this headache-inducing cacophony of strangeness. There's farting, flying techno grandpas, random shots of insects having sex, and balls. So many balls. An incomprehensible number of shots featuring, involving, or focused explicitly around the presentation and mystical use of tanuki testicles. While it's my understanding that they are anatomically significant to their cultural mythology, it doesn't make it any less uncomfortable or downright terrifying. Pom Poko most frequently reminded me of the anarchic abandon of the happiness of the katakuris, and that's something that should probably never be said of a children's film. There's a street festival that mirrors the elephants on parade sequence from Dumbo, albeit stretched out way past the point of comfort. Skydiving tanukis use their engorged testicles as both parachutes and weapons, and a 999-year-old senile wizard sails to heaven on a boat made of his own scrotum. For every moment of levity, there's a realistic-looking animal corpse set to traumatize an unsuspecting audience. Add all this to an egregiously overlong runtime, and on the one hand it's too broad to live in one bracket, and on the other it's too niche for mass appeal. And that wraps up the second episode of Discovering Ghibli. Much more of a mixed bag this time around, but each film has its own commendable high points. See you again for episode 3 at some point in the near future. A psychedelic shout out to our Patreon producers Jennifer C, Claire MD, and Nicholas Lair-Revere, and a big steaming bowl of noodles and ham for all these amazing folks who support us over on Patreon. Where would you rank each of these films in your own personal list of Ghibli favourites? What Ghibli film are you most looking forward to us covering in this series? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, the best way to help us out is to like, share this video around, and subscribe to the channel, and check out our Patreon at the link in the description below. Hopefully it won't be too long before we have another episode of this out, and click just here for the first episode in case you missed it. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, this is In Frame Out.